Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Construct Innovate webinar series on modern methods of construction. This week, the topic for consideration is standardization for modern methods of construction. This is an 8-week webinar series. My name is Jamie Goggins, and I'm co-director of Construct Innovate, which is Ireland's National Research Centre for Construction Technology and Innovation. The webinar series is hosted by Construct Innovate, together with a number of different partners. As I said, this is an 8-week webinar series, where this week we're concentrating on standardization for modern methods of construction. You can watch these webinars back on the Construct Innovate YouTube channel afterwards, except for the Q&A session will not be made public afterwards. We're absolutely delighted to have three eminent speakers this week again. Really fortunate to talk around standardization for modern methods of construction. So we've first speaker will be Joan MacMahon, who's Senior Architect Advisor and Head of Unit in the Housing Advisory of the Social Housing Division in the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage. And she's going to talk about standardization in social housing, and particularly around the design manual for quality housing that was recently published there last year. Then we have Brian Mallon, Associate Director from Hawkins Brown Architects, who've done great work on a standardized design approach study in there. He'll bring us through that. Then we have Ronan Lonergan, who's Pre-Construction and Innovation Lead at Cairn's Homes. And Cairns have a really good process for going through in terms of both looking at innovation and incorporating that innovation within their construction processes, but also through the standardization side of things. So he's going to show us what they do in Cairns, which is really exciting and great stuff. So we'll have our three presentations, each about 15 minutes each, and then after the presentations, we will have the Q&A session. So if you have any questions from any of our speakers, please do pose them in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. As I said, we'll deal with all the questions at the very end, but you don't need to wait till all the presentations before you pose your Q&A. You can do that during the presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker being Joan MacMahon, who's Senior Architect Advisor and Head of Unit of the Housing Advisory and Social Housing Division in the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage. So over to you, Joan.
Thanks, Jamie, and hello everyone. I'm delighted to be here with you today. Today I'm just going to share that, and hopefully everybody can see that now. Great. I'd just like to talk to you today in my presentation about some design standardization measures that the department has put in place with regard to social housing delivery. So Jamie referenced their design manual for quality housing, which was published in 2022, the employer's requirements document, which is undergoing continual review, and of which there was a recent update published just earlier last week. So these guidance documents developed by the department are intended to facilitate delivery of consistent standards of social housing accommodation nationally. So I suppose in terms of the design manual, taking into consideration the ambitions for delivery of housing under the government's new housing plan, delivering homes, building communities, these documents are intended to facilitate delivery of consistent standards of accommodation nationally. In summary, the design manual illustrates site layout principles and internal layouts, which are deemed to be consistent with department guidelines and eligible for funding. The employer's requirements document sets out an appropriate level of specification for social housing delivery. And the standardized design approach brings a significant benefit to industry in terms of efficiencies with tendering, supply and programming as a result of a more standardized approach instead of works requirements. So if you're a contractor or a consultant developing designs or tendering for multiple housing contracts across different local authorities, you'll have a greater certainty of the brief and works requirements from the outset. So in July 2025, last year, the government approved a new single approval process for social housing projects up to 200 million. And this new process applies from the 9th of January this year. And this process streamlines the previous 4-stage approval process to a single approval stage, and that's pre-planning. Mandatory use of the design manual and employers' requirements is embedded within this process. And again, that was given government approval last year. There is an allowance for an acceptable standardized design approach that can be considered, subject to agreement with the department. So again, the purpose is driving efficiencies and consistency nationally. So in terms of the design manual itself, it provides guidance on design of residential site layouts, internal layouts of new apartments, duplexes, houses and community dwellings. It's intended for local authorities, approved housing bodies, consultants, and effectively everyone involved with delivery of social housing, developed following consultation with the sector, who provided many useful insights, which was incorporated during the final document, the preparation of the final document. So it's important also to notice that while the site layouts presuppose indicative greenfield or brownfield sites, department policy very much encourages town centre brownfield housing, and it's acknowledged each site is different. Each site has to respond to its immediate context, but the clear principles set out in that guidance should be transferable across individual sites. So the manual comprises 5 chapters. For the purpose of this webinar, I'll outline briefly the content of Chapter 5, which includes guidance on individual internal layouts. Those internal layouts are developed to provide a graphical response and representation to space standards that were embedded within the sector in terms of quality housing for sustainable communities and apartments guidelines. So these individual layouts cover houses, so everything from single story to 3-story, 4-bed to 2-bed, corner units, narrow, deep plan, and so on. Apartments, again, from studio to 3-bed, 2 and 3-bed duplexes, community dwellings, universal design dwellings, and all of the layouts are available in AutoCAD format on the department's website. So these next few slides just go through, gives you an indication of, I suppose, the types of units and the type of detail that's across Chapter 5. So they are indicative internal layouts, as you can see. The drawing on the left there that you can see is a house layout. So that will be a typical 2-bed, 3-bed, 2-story house. Again, all the floor areas are indicated in the drawing to align with space standards. Similarly, on the right, there's an apartment layout there that you can see. And then I suppose on the next couple of pages, you'll see duplex layout. The image on the left indicates a ground floor UD layout with a 2-story duplex overhead. The top right-hand drawing indicates community dwelling layout, which is for 4 persons with intellectual disability and a carer. And the bottom right-hand image there is for a 2-bed, 4-person unit to UD home standard. So I suppose, as I've mentioned in the last couple of slides, the manual includes a number of universal design layouts, which were developed with the input of colleagues in the National Disability Authority Centre for Excellence in Universal Design. So they're developed to UD home standard to meet the need of a wide range of users, including older persons, young children, people with disabilities. They include a number of features and all the requirements for UD home, including, for instance, an accessible shower room, bedroom directly adjacent to the main bathroom, allowing for direct connection to the bedroom and hall, 1500 by 1500 millimeter clear circulation space immediately inside the entrance, 1500 millimeter turning circles in the rooms, space around furniture, and a mixture of shallow and deep storage. So you can see, I suppose, on the right-hand side there, how some of those unit types allow for those configurations. Then to talk a little bit about MMC, I suppose the title of this webinar references that. While all the internal layouts within the design manual allow for delivery using 2D panelized systems, following feedback from industry, the department identified a limited number of designs and layouts from the design manual, which have been adjusted to allow for ease of delivery using 3D MMC. So this unit on the right, for instance, is a 1-bed UD layout that is also available in the design manual in its original form and suitable for 2D panelized. And this particular unit allows for volumetric construction. So again, there are 9 very sort of commonly used units that have been tweaked a little to allow for 3D offsite manufacture, and they're also available in AutoCAD format on the department's website. So I suppose talking about the design manual, it could appear to be, I suppose, we're looking at a number of simple plan drawings, but the delivery of housing is critical, I suppose, in terms of meeting those very high targets and ambitions as set under the new housing plan. So the majority of projects I'm going to go through now in the next few slides have been delivered using a design and build approach. And they'll show you how a number of schemes have been developed, from small infill developments to large urban proposals. So talking about a design and build approach, this form of contract has a capacity to drive a number of efficiencies, including efficiencies in procurement timelines when utilizing frameworks. Standardization of unit types generates efficiencies for design teams, contractors, manufacturers, allows for innovations whereby contractors can propose the most efficient construction methodology once performance, certification, and quality standards are met, which is critical. Compliance sample allows for early sign-off of key elements, and there's greater cost certainty and significant reduction in change orders. So also to mention that local authority regional design and build frameworks have now been established through work undertaken by local authorities supported by the Department Housing Agency and Housing Delivery Coordination Office across 5 regions, serving 25 local authorities. So a number of local authorities are delivering projects utilising these frameworks and combining them with standardised layouts, and we're seeing greater efficiencies being achieved there. So this particular project that's on the screen there is a Dublin City Council proposal for 110 units, and you can see a high proportion of those units are design manual layouts. And that will be delivered under a design and build contract. This next proposal is a small infill project in County Carlow, utilising a part, I suppose, as part refurb, part new build. So the units at the front are refurb, and then, as you can see to the rear, there's some new build units, primarily utilising design manual layouts. This next scheme again is a local authority older person scheme. Design and build approach is being followed here, and predominantly utilising design manual layouts. Interestingly here, it's a design and build contract. The contractor has proposed part delivery utilising 3D volumetric system, sort of a concrete certified system there. This next, that's on site at the moment, this is another scheme on site, Monaghan County Council. Again, a significant proportion utilising design manual layouts. Again, on site, a D&B contract, and in this situation, the contractors proposed timber frame solution. Louth County Council, similarly, 97 dwellings, of which again, a high proportion design manual layouts. And again, you can see a range of unit types being utilised there, incorporating UD. That's on site as design and build contract, and again, utilising a timber frame form of construction. So I suppose those last few slides give a good indication and a really positive indication of the increased use of the design manual across local authority delivery, even prior to the revised approval process and prior to the mandated use of design manual across social housing delivery. Now, I suppose, as with every department publication, format of both design manual and the employer's requirements is such that they can be updated and will be updated. The employer's requirements, as I said earlier, has just been reissued earlier this year, just to update in accordance with a number of updates in terms of performance and so on. The design manual will be updated as needed once we have taken on board a number of the learnings across local authorities who are now implementing so many schemes. So this image on the right is for a standard 3-bed dwelling, and it is from 1936, 90 years ago. So again, they're very simple dwellings. Very interesting to see how much our expectation has changed, I suppose, in terms of internal comfort, you know, sanitation, thermal envelope, and all of those things. But critically, I suppose, the transformative value of access to housing remains the same. So as I said earlier, it's really positive to see so many proposals coming forward using design manual for social housing delivery. We hope and expect that standardised approach will deliver benefits and efficiencies in meeting housing delivery targets, and critically, I suppose, in delivering quality housing for future generations. So that's it for my presentation. Thanks so much for listening.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Joan. That's great. And I suppose to see it being used and in action, especially at larger scale projects in there, and the adoption more recently, I suppose, in a number of years for modern methods of construction for the 3D volumetric to work as well. So obviously all work for 2D panelized, but then to be able to do this as 3D volumetric as well. So if anyone has any questions from Joan, then please do pose them in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and we'll deal with those at the very end. So our second presenter is Brian Mallon, who's Associate Director at Hawkins Brown Architects, and he's going to go through the standardized design approach study that they have done within Hawkins Brown, which is a really, really good study. So over to you, Brian.
Okay. Thanks, Jeremy. Just a second. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. Yeah, so we completed a study on behalf of the Department of Housing last year. It actually was published just last September, called Standardized Design Approaches, with a subheading of Promoting Greater Adoption of MMC. So I'll talk you through, I guess, give you an overview of that. It's a publicly available document, but give you an overview of that study. It was a multidisciplinary team led by Hawkins Brown through the Dublin office, supported by Ramboll, Structure and M&E, Mitchell, McDermott on costing, and Jensen Hughes on fire. And throughout that process, we worked closely with the department and closely with both a steering group and a stakeholder group, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. I guess the purpose of this report that was set out from the department was to raise awareness and promote the adoption of standardized approaches, and with that to enable greater use of MMC. The target audience for the exercise is the construction industry at large, really, including small SMEs. I think Ronan is going to speak after myself now, and I think we're quite aware that some of the larger developers, the likes of Cairn, obviously have very well established processes, but that there was a benefit in setting out, I guess, the ways our approach to standardization could benefit developers and house builders at a smaller scale. And I think Joan's alluded to it as well, but obviously the benefits are to reduce the costs and increase the use of modern methods of construction. And I guess standardization as a part of that has the ability to create that sort of aggregated demand and greater certainty for the industry, which allows the MMC providers to respond to that certainty. The focus of our study was on the layouts, the construction methodology, the building services, and the building components, and we'll go through them in a couple of minutes. All of this work is building on work that's already out there. So Design Manual for Quality Housing and the LDA Apartment Typology booklet were two key sources we took as a basis for this study. So the report is broken down into 4 chapters. So part 1 is the context and scope, which I'll talk through in a minute. Part 2 is the dwelling selection. I'll talk through, I guess, how we came to the dwellings that we selected for development, for further development within the study. Part 3, we think, is a very important section, I guess, is us trying to capture all of the different considerations that have gone into the design of those dwellings, and that's trying to pull together essentially the parameters around different MMC systems and to try to set them out in one place to make it easily accessible to designers to understand how they would implement various different systems. I think that's a section that we developed quite closely with a number of the different MMC suppliers, and I guess it's acknowledging that it requires a broad understanding of systems and how you would implement those systems, which is maybe a slight shift for designers than from a sort of first principles point of view, that it's really about understanding how you would work within those systems. And then part 4 is the model designs, where we set out a number of model designs and go through options in terms of structural design and building services. So in terms of the context, I guess the first thing we did was go through a literature review to understand what's happening elsewhere. I think this is a topic that is quite There's a lot of activity both in Ireland, the UK, and internationally on this. There's a number of similar studies happening in other countries. There's been similar studies in Wales, Scotland, Canada, Australia, and I think the England as well has a number of studies ongoing in this space. Coming back to Ireland for a minute, I guess what we have is, as Joan has outlined, there's been a quality manual, which has been, or design manual for quality housing, which has been around for a couple of years, although has been updated recently, and the LDA apartment typology, which are being used for social and affordable housing. And then obviously, as Joan has said, there's a number of those types. Well, all of the types have been optimized for Cat 2 for panelized MMC, and then the shorter list optimized for Cat 1 MMC. I think one of the, I guess, our takeaways from the literature review is that there's been a lot of publication in recent years about the benefits and the barriers to MMC, but what there was probably less was sort of practical guidance around how you could implement different MMC systems. And we thought this study had the ability then to start to feed into that and possibly fill part of that gap. Part of our study was to review the regulatory framework that they're designed, that you would bring these designs forward in, but it's not really to address any of those issues. There's various other studies ongoing about how that system might be streamlined, but needless to say, any of the systems that we're looking at systems that will be fully certified and would have Agreement certs where required. So the stakeholder engagement, we had I guess 2 key workshops, quite well attended workshops, and a number of individual stakeholder meetings. I think the stakeholder workshops were key to us in terms of understanding all of the systems and getting a broad consensus on what typology. So in the first stakeholder workshop, we focused very much on what typologies would be most beneficial for a sort of wide spectrum of projects. On the second one, we focused a little bit more in on the detail of what systems we would look at and how those systems could be used. And as I said, I think it's key that to any use of MMC that there's a sort of collaborative approach that recognizes that, you know, the expert in all of these systems are the suppliers of these systems, and if we're to implement these systems within our designs, we have to work with the specialists on that. So in the dwelling selection was the first stage after literature review. We looked at a sort of huge range of typologies, ranging from houses, duplexes, triplex, and apartments. And we looked at typologies that have been used in Ireland by public sector, private sector, also typologies that have been used internationally, and tried to identify which typologies we think would be most appropriate for this study. We developed a set of criteria that looked at the sort of efficiencies around each dwelling, but also the efficiencies around the use of land and the use of an overall site to achieve density, and tried to create a sort of balanced approach that would assess I guess a typology's ability to be an efficient typology, but also to achieve a decent density. Where we came down to on the end was these 5 broad topics. So a house typology, which Joan's already covered a little bit, and so your most typical a 2-story 3-bed home that can be used in a terrace of dwellings. A duplex with an external stairs. Also a variant upon that was a duplex with an internal stairs, which we identified through our study was less well used, but has the ability to achieve greater densities because of its more compact form. And then a triplex, which is one that came up quite a lot in our first stakeholder engagement, is essentially a stack of 3 individual units, all with their own dedicated stairs and dedicated entrance at the ground floor. This is a typology that's been used quite a bit in the UK and hasn't been used as much here. There's some challenges, I guess, in terms of how that will be used from our Part M, which I'll talk to later. But it was felt coming out of that workshop that this would be a useful typology in the context of the Compact Settlement Guidelines being published recently as well. That this is a typology that can play a key part in terms of increasing the density of a largely low-rise development, and possibly avoiding the use or the reliance on lift core apartment buildings. So that's the typology that we developed specifically for this exercise. And then an apartment typology as well, I guess, to ensure that we had the sort of broad range of typologies. across the study. As I said, we looked at all of these in terms of what they could achieve in density, even on a sort of in terms of a hypothetical site, but to give us a comparative analysis of what sort of densities you would achieve. Obviously, in some respects, you could say the most efficient typology on an individual basis is always going to be a terraced house. But obviously, in order to achieve more sustainable densities, you have to start introducing more complex stack typology. So it was trying to get a balance between that sort of site efficiency and the unit efficiency. So going into the design considerations, as I said, we thought this was a key part of the study that sort of represents, I guess, all of the learnings we took from those stakeholder workshops and those individual engagements, and tried to distill them down into something that's hopefully useful for designers to be able to go to as a first pass. It's not going to allow you to be able to design everything around typology, but it will, or around a system, but it will hopefully allow you to have a good understanding of the parameters of each of the different systems. And the systems we decided to focus on were Cat1 LGS, Cat2 LGS, so that's a panelized LGS and a volumetric LGS, Cat2 timber panels, Cat2 precast, and Cat7 insulated concrete formwork. So then I guess the next part of that was to start to outline what the parameters of each of those systems are, and what are the influences on those. So one of the key influences, particularly on the volumetric, but also to some degree on the panelized, is your transportation. So there's limits on what is feasible in terms of transportation, and that's a big driver in terms of the size of the overall modules that you would use, particularly in Cat1. We also looked at the manufacturing constraints, and most of the manufacturers that we spoke to can easily meet the transportation constraints. So transportation constraints is the more limiting factor in most cases, but we try to, I guess, capture what we think is the range of constraints within the manufacturing industry. Setting out interchangeable typologies, I think, is a key aspect. So between the different typologies that we developed for this exercise, we tried to have a consistent depth of each of those typologies so that you can start to mix and match them and you can start to combine them. It also allows for, I guess, it brings us an element of standardization to things like trusses and the way you start to lay out those homes as well. So it has sort of knock-on benefits as well. And then I think the next two are interrelated, is trying to define the parameters around a flexible structure. So it's trying to design spans that can be utilized, that can be achieved, I should say, across different systems, and trying to set out build-ups that can allow for different systems to come forward. The likelihood on any live project is that at the early stage of a project, you're probably unlikely to know exactly what system you're going to use, and depending on the procurement process, you might not know that until much later on, and you might not have the contractor on board until much later on. So it's trying to identify how you can set up your typologies and enable them to allow for multiple systems of construction. So this is going into this in a bit more detail, where we started to map out, according to a number of different systems, the wall types and the wall zones required to allow those different systems to come forward. So we defined a number of different wall types. We also did this for floor types, and then created what overall depth you would need to allow for that zone to allow you to create to provide all of these systems. And on any actual project, you may decide some of these are not feasible, some of them are, and you may be able to narrow this down and therefore create more efficiencies, because there's always a little bit of a balance between the overall efficiency of a home in terms of its spatial area and the ability to create flexibility, which often will require you to go to a sort of worst case build up. So there's a balance there that needs to be taken on a project basis to understand what systems are likely and to design to those ones. We also looked at what elements could be repeatable. And I think Ronan will probably go into this in more detail in his presentation. But I think for this, we identified what are the key elements that can be repeatable across a project and potentially even across multiple projects. So external doors, internal doors, trying to use standardized door leaves to achieve the required effective clear widths. Roof trusses, as I said, if we standardize the depth of a home, we can then have the same roof truss across multiple unit types as well, which also has benefits in terms of how you might integrate different typologies within a terrace. standardized windows, and then standardized balconies. We also looked at building services and how the sort of kit of parts within a building services could be standardized as well. Another part of the study we did was then to take each one of those systems, and then we looked at it in a sort of in an abstract way, so to look at 1 square meter of wall and floor for each of those systems and compare the embodied carbon for each of them. This is probably a starter, it's probably worth to say. There's obviously a number of levers you can pull within these analyses to start to change them. You know, it might be increasing the recycled content of steel, switching insulation types from PIR to mineral wool. I think another big component to look at is the outer relief of the facade. Some of these, the first 3 in this study all have a solid brick. The last 2 have a brick slip, and you start to see the difference that has, so that large, that 42 in the sort of dark red is the brick facade in the first 3, and the 14 on the last 2 in a slightly lighter red is the brick slip. So you can see that the brick slip has, in embodied carbon terms, has a big advantage on how it impacts on the overall performance. But I guess broadly speaking, you end up with timber frame being quite efficient. In terms of the LGS, you end up with your Cat 1 LGS being having a higher embodied carbon than the Cat 2. The reason for that is the increased metal. So you can see that in the bottom section of that. So the 118 versus the 62 is the increased steel in that. And that's because of the doubling up of structure that you get in Cat 1. There's also a slight increase in the transportation because you are essentially transporting it as a volume rather than being able to put more of the panelized system on the back of a truck. But again, as I said, these are kind of to give people a starting point to understand how these different systems perform. Within each of these systems, there are things you can start to do to improve those results as well, which we've also outlined in the report. In terms of the variation to facade, I guess it's probably important to say, and I guess everyone gets a little bit nervous when you talk about standardization as to whether it means every single house looks the same. Our view would be strongly that it shouldn't mean that, and that what you're looking at standardizing in the study is your layouts, your building methodology, and the components within those. But that doesn't mean that you don't respond to your local context, and that could be true. The design of the roof could be through the design of the facade, the composition of the materials in the facade, the composition of the windows. In this example, we've kept the same window, but in theory, you could have different windows and different schemes once you have a standardized approach across that scheme. That means you don't have a very high number of standardized windows or a very high number of window types. So then going into the model design, so this is where we had essentially selected those types. So the types we selected were a terrace house, and the basis for that is the house type that Joan referred to earlier in the design manual for quality housing, that's referred to as H8. And that was already, we took the version which has already been optimized for Cat 1 MMC. Then we looked at the duplex. So we took an example from the LDA in this case, which has an external stairs, has a 2-bed apartment on the ground floor and a 3-bed maisonette above. Then we took so D2 and T1 are ones we designed specifically for this exercise, looking at an internalized duplex with a UD unit on the ground floor and a 3-bed above. And then a triplex, which has 3 individual apartments, 2 1-beds, and a 2-bed, 3-person on the upper floor, which I can maybe talk to. But I guess I mentioned that earlier that this typology is quite well used in the UK, but hasn't been overly well used here. And I think a lot of that is to do around the stairs. So we have a more onerous requirement around Part M in terms of design of that stairs up until you get to your accommodation level. So our stairs is much larger and has an additional landing. But through this process, I guess we did prove that it can work here and it can be done. We tried to develop it in a way that is quite a compact form. So it kind of all starts with how you design that ground floor apartment and comes upward from there. But you essentially start to get area coming back to you as those stairs drop off, hence why you can have a 2-bed, 3 on the upper floor. And then A1 apartment, which we took one of the LDA apartment types again for that as a reference point. And then each one of those we set them out under each discipline. So we set it out architecturally, categorized or sort of did a table on each of them that sort of shows how many different types you have of external doors, windows, heating systems, etc. And we went across each one of those types. I've just taken this one as an example for today. We then went across each type and looked at its structure and building services. We set out each type according to a different MMC system to demonstrate what those parameters are in a bit more detail, but that's not to say that each one of those types couldn't be delivered across all of the different systems. We also looked at how they could be developed through Cat 1 and Cat 2 systems across each one of the types. And then we set out the building services with our building services consultants. And again, we tried to keep it, I guess, as simple as possible across all of those systems, or across all of the types. But we did look at how different systems could be used across different types, again, to demonstrate some different approaches. And I guess that's kind of really where we are with it. So we published it in September. Currently we're doing a little bit more work on taking the typologies and developing up Revit models or BIM models for each one of those, and we'll have a coordinated model that will be able to be made available for each one of those types that has one particular MMC system demonstrated within that. So that will be finished that in the next couple of weeks. All right. It's me. I'll hand back to Jamie or over to Ronan.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Brian. That's great. A lot of work there gone through in terms of assessing the various different typologies, or even just come down to the 5 that you studied in more detail on that. And yeah, and interested in obviously looking and taking learnings from, say, across in the UK and that, but then understanding that some of our building regulations will be slightly different, so it's not just copy and paste across it. And also, can we improve upon that as well? And then getting the point across that, yes, like, a pair of runners or a car, we have the core or standardized details, like a pair of shoes. It's the same sole that's across so many different models, and a few different variations and tweaking them. You can get so many different looks in there, but the effectively core components are the same. And then you standardize those, and you can get efficiencies into it. And certainty, I suppose, in the market is another part of it as well, to make this work. So then we're over to our third speaker. So if anyone's any questions, obviously, for our speakers, then please do put them in the Q&A function. I see them coming in at the bottom. Also, just to make you aware that in the chat there, I put in the links to the various different documents or reports or guidelines that have been mentioned here, and in the recording that we'll make those available in the notes in the recording as well at the bottom, so people can go directly into those. So we're over to our third speaker, Ronan Lonergan, who's the pre-construction and innovation lead at Cairn's Home. So Cairn's is one of the largest house builders in the country, and I'm going to learn from him in terms of how they go through things in terms of their standardization approach and innovation. So over to you, Ronan.
Jamie? So I think the sequence of presentations is actually very helpful today. So if you think of what Joan has started with in terms of the directive or the high level direction that's given from the Department of Housing, and then the more detailed study that Brian has worked through, this is really an example of what that means closer to the coalface in terms of a housing developer such as Cairn, and how we might deliver out on that information and use it to deliver some of our schemes and some of our housing schemes that are available right across the country at the moment. So I just said I'd start off. So innovation for us and standardization are very much all in part of the same thing. So we have a great culture of standardization and innovation in the business. In 2025, really our focus was about keeping innovation there for people to see and moving quickly and trying to create idea conversion and create tangible value for the business, for our customers, and for everybody else that's associated with us, and including our supply chain and our subcontractors. And then storytelling. I suppose some of these ideas are very complicated. I think standardization is one of those things. If we can make a little bit more sense to the wider public, that's of huge value and what it means. And I suppose one thing that I often tell people about standardization is there's so many different variations of it. So I'm going to show you a little bit more about the plasterboard and the screw and the timber today, whereas Joan and Brian is very much about the layouts, the elevations, and setting that out. So how do we get down into the next level of standardization where we can look at details and consistency for our supply chain. So if they're buying a particular board or timber size, that they can invest in that without worrying that from job to job that we're going to change that, or how we even manage that with each of the different consultants we have. And then just in terms of the timeline and the different cultural things that we've worked on, and both in terms of MMC and just innovation more broadly, we started off in 2015, 2016 as a business. We started to standardize our timber frame kits quite quickly. We started to invest in bathroom pods. We're looking at utility pods now. We use off-site prefabricated balconies with a number of different suppliers. We launched the Cairn Technical Design Library in 2020. And then in more recent times, we've invested in more bespoke products like IntiWall, which is an internal prefabricated plasterboard wall system. We've started off a number of different passive house schemes, which has been a brilliant thing. And we've started to hand over the first couple of them at the end of last year. And at the moment, we're building our innovation test center as well, and a number of other things coming in the future. So if you think, Brian kind of slowly or shortly touched on this in his presentation, but I think the natural tendency for most people, particularly in the wider public that aren't used to dealing with construction, when you say standardization, is to think of a monotonous apartment block, usually associated with kind of Central or Eastern Europe, and how it mightn't be a particularly nice environment often, or even if you think of some of the apartment blocks that were built in North County Dublin around the 60s and the 70s, and there wasn't too much thought put into where shops would come after, or facilities like schools. That's not what we're talking about. I often try to highlight three different examples, such as Georgian Dublin, we have the Housemans Paris, and we have New York Broadstones. These are all really good examples of standardization, and particularly if you think of Georgian Dublin was probably one of the most active construction times in Dublin and Ireland's history. Relied heavily on standardization. So you're talking about the same chimney size, the same chimney chutes, same window details, same window sills, same steps, same doors. And nobody thinks of this as a standardized block, funnily enough. We think of this as being a kind of beautiful old piece of bespoke architecture in a city, but the reality is it's a heavily standardized commodity, and it would have made for easy manufacturing and easy scale when the country was trying to improve the level of housing and building in the city. So just in terms of how we think about standardization, it's all like what Brian had said there, the ultimate amount of compatibility or adaptability in the schemes. So just you can see a picture of 5 housing schemes that we have. They're all based on the same chassis, the same home behind, but we get different elevations. So that's the reality of this type of work coming to life. People that are there in the homes, they don't realise that their home is the same as it is if it was in Wicklow or Kildare or Meath. And we get all the added benefits of, obviously from our supply chain's point of view, getting that value of scale or value of capacity in terms of having the same window sizes or timber sizes or roof dimensions, that kind of thing. And then we apply the same principles to our apartment delivery as well. And there's a couple of examples down the bottom there. Yeah, so this is kind of this is just a tester for you, but this is how we like to think about our homes. And this is one of the first configurators that we made as a business. I'm going to show you something a little bit more complicated later in the presentation, but how can we create standard home types and use different facades? So this is a really good example of that. And we created a bit of software with a software company actually that specialized in architectural software. We could tweak our different facades, and many of these have ended up in the homes that we've delivered in the last number of years. So if we think about what iteration 1, maybe back in 2019 and 2020, when we really started to document what we wanted to do, we started off with the Technical Design Library, which is a major resource that's open to all of our design consultants and subcontractor partners, of which there would probably be the guts of about 500 or 600 people. Just on the consultancy side. So we probably work with about 40 to 50 different design consultants. That could be fire engineers, that could be architects, engineers, architectural conservation consultants, you'd have landscape designers, mechanical engineers, and so on. And really what we've tried to do is just document each of our different home types, catalog them, give them names. So in the first number one there on the screen is assemblies, or what we call the library of homes, which is all of our standard CAD files, each to the standard Cairn house types. And then in the second bit in the middle there, which is the construction detail library, is a catalogue of about 40 to 50 details for both houses, duplexes and apartments, where we start to detail out the exact products that we use, if that's a skirting board, a window, a particular type of insulation, brickwork, or even the concrete mix. And it means that from job to job, then an architect or an engineer isn't, I suppose, in a way, reinventing the wheel or coming up with the same product. And that gives us the ability, obviously, to go off and bulk procure some of these products from the wider industry, and in a way where they get more certainty and they can manufacture, hopefully, or procure at cheaper costs from supply chains, either in Ireland, Europe, or wider afield. And then the last bit is really components, which is things like kitchens, wardrobes, stairs, lobby layouts, pods and windows, and how they work. And obviously they're quite key parts of the building, and we really want to set dimensions for them. So again, we have a bathroom supplier in Italy that make all of our bathroom pods, so that they're getting consistency and they can get the added advantages in a factory environment for scaling, and we're not changing that bathroom layout from scheme to scheme. So this is just an example of how the planning drawings go from planning to detailed design, and you can see the level of information that's on the right hand side there, and then we highlight in blue the bits that the architects need to change, and then often other parts of the drawing tend to be locked. This is a blown up version of that detail you've seen, so you can start to see how we totally codify everything that we do. These numbers, you'll see there's numbers if you zoom in there on each of the products. On the left hand side, there's two different timber frame suppliers who have very, very small differences in their timber frame, but we need to take account of them. There's about 10 mil. And then on the right hand side is their actual fix and detail into the slab as well, slightly different. So depending on which timber frame supplier the procurement or commercial team pick for the scheme, we can quickly adapt our drawings from to one or the other. And then we're also getting consistency there with our products. So there's coding out there with the bold lettering that's happening at the start of each text. And then if we jump on into the component bit, this is how we think about the inside of our building. So similar to what Brian had, we have coded out for particular door types, ID1, ID2, ID3. They're totally understood across the business. And then the procurement team can go and bulk buy them on a yearly basis. So they'll contact our 3 or 4 different suppliers, tell them how many ID1s we're predicting we'll need this year, or ID2s, and go off and purchase them at a preferred rate. And it puts them in a position that they can manufacture them even when maybe a scheme hasn't been signed off, because they know that consistency in terms of detail or design is going to be there when it eventually comes to order. And then there's other components such as the stairs, shower trays, kitchens, trusses, heat pumps, and service box. We've added a number of more components over the years, both to houses and apartments. And this is a more detailed version of that. So if you think of our stair, we have only a certain amount of types in our housing blocks. So we have about 4 stair types, and 2 of our stair manufacturers are totally familiar with them. They can go off and fabricate them in the background, and consistency in terms of details again, and then goings and risings, all those things that change from scheme to scheme, not because anyone naturally wants them to move from scheme to scheme, but just because there's so many people involved, and there's the tendency for entropy, I suppose, where if you start off in multiple different places and head out in different directions, it's very rare that anyone would end up with the same result unless you manage it. So that's really a key thing to what we try to do. And then you have your standard shower trays that we use across the board, that we have a framework for. And then obviously you can see the kitchens and the trusses there in more detail as well. Yeah, so I suppose that was what we did first as a business. And then we started to realize that it still didn't give us enough control in terms of what we wanted over consistency or delivery for our supply chain. Where we're getting the feedback from our subcontractors that this drawing is slightly different from this scheme, or timber frame suppliers saying, while your living room is supposed to be 3.5 meters wide, and on this scheme it was 3 0.52 wide, and what that means for us is we have to reset back up our machines and we have to change everything, and that was very frustrating. And we talked to our consultants, and they were really trying their best. So we said, well, what system can we create that makes this even better or even more consistent? And I suppose on the screen here is a really good example of the problem that we had. So we have 4 different architectural partners that we work with. So you have McCross and O'Rourke there, you have BBA, you have Mola, and you have C.W. O'Brien. Each of them drawing what they think is representative of the library, but you're always going to get small differences in terms of who actually sits down at the desk and draws that out. So that's part, and you can see that the information is presented in subtly different ways on different schemes, which is great, but in some ways not helpful when you're trying to standardize and scale, particularly on housing. So what we really wanted to do was to try to create a standard drawing across all schemes so that the information is the same, whether I'm on a Cairn scheme from in Wicklow or in Meath or in Dublin or in Cork or in Galway. I'll effectively be looking at the same information, albeit with a slightly different title block from each of the architectural consultants. But the fonts would be the same, the line widths would be the same, the text, the lettering, the numbering, the dimensions, and we can start to get that consistency across the schemes. And then that would apply as well through elevations as well and sections and everything else. So that was the goal initially. And what we wanted to try, this is kind of how the industry tends to work at the minute. As a developer, we'll often feed people a brief, but we're trying to standardize across different schemes. So the schemes will be very similar, but they're all heading off in different directions with different project managers, different architectural practices, different engineers. And again, they're coming up with slightly different designs, and it's not something that we want, but something that happens. And it also has a tendency to create more mistakes. It can be slower and it can be resource heavy. So we thought, how can we centralize this and do more of the things automated or in a way that we're going to make less mistakes? So we started to try to create what we initially called the Cairn Design Platform, where we could start to feed architects and engineers at a project level even more detailed drawings, and so to cut down on part of their workload and also to create more consistency. And this was with the goal of having fewer errors, having more of a common standard, and that we could push updates as well, and we have more confidence in the delivery. So why are we doing this? We're doing it to try to create a culture of disciplined design. We're trying to limit uncontrolled changes. You often get the case that you might have a young architect or a young student, they'll be in a practice, they won't appreciate fully what jumping into a Revit file and changing a certain dimension means. It mightn't be as big of a deal on some projects, but it's a huge deal on our scheme. So it's trying to manage all that. Obviously, centralized design governance. If we change our bathtub type or our shower tray, that we can push updates out to each of our architects, consultants pretty quickly, like syncing an InDesign file or even a software update on a computer in a similar way. And then we're trying to streamline the design process and make it more efficient, reduce time spent on repetitive tasks, and allow people to focus on more complex tasks. So I often give the example of a landscape architect that might come in and they're better placed to be looking at the parks in a scheme rather than drawing the same paving layouts that they did on a number of different iterations before that. Yeah, so I'll finish up with this. This is a short video of the Cairn Digital Design Toolkit. Part of phase 1 was finished last year, and we rolled it out on a first scheme. And the intention in 2026 is to roll this out across the board on our low density schemes. And we're concurrently developing the apartment one as well. And we're finishing off, I suppose, we're adding townhouses and duplexes and that type of thing into the digital design toolkit for this year as well. But we've tried it on one scheme in North County Dublin in Swords, and it's gone very, very well. So the intention is to roll that out even further. So I'll just play this video now. Yeah, so this is part of the component library. So we can bake in loads of metadata as well into the product. So we have standard Revit files there where we can add in Uniclass codes. We can add procurement data into the background, which is really helpful. And this is really the key piece. If we give an instruction that we want a different type of facade, or we want a different type of terrace or a different size of terrace, instead of maybe an architect determining themselves as to what width that might be, it's all automated. So on the left-hand side there is a type of script that's running through Revit that we've co-developed with an architectural practice, and it's all baked on or based on our internal Cairn design. So I can very quickly turn a terrace from a 4-bed to a 3-bed. And as you can see down in the bottom left-hand corner, it's updating everything from our window door. So I'll just jump back in there. So this is the configurator piece, as I was saying. So on the left-hand side, we have different set elevation types that we have, and we're adding to that all the time. So that means, like Brian had previously mentioned, if we were building in Wicklow, say, we might be more inclined to use a lighter brick or a stone cladding to reflect the colours or the context of that area, if it's by the sea or by the beach. We have the same in Innovate, whereas you might, if you're in West Dublin, you might be more inclined to use a heavier brick to reflect maybe some of the railways around that area, or the cultural or construction heritage in that area as well. So it's a really important tool for us. And on the back end, as you can imagine, it just frees us up to do a lot of things around procurement and bulk buying, which is really important. And then the last thing I just wanted to add in is that data is just so important for a business like us. When we go to standardize at this type of level and we've consistency over the information, we can create massive amount of dashboards. So I can tell you how many of a particular house type that I've done in a certain year, or how standardized we are. So we're at 61% standardized. We don't want to get that to 100%, believe it or not. There are schemes that we don't want to do standardized. There are times where we buy schemes from other developers and we deliver them out. But that's kind of how it works. So the data is hugely important as well. So I'll just finish it up there. Thanks, everyone.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ronan. Very, very exciting stuff. I mean, I suppose it shows in the company. I know you're quite a large company in there, but quite a lot going on. But making a decision early on to reflect on what you do and what you do well, and then to start to first thing capture it, record it, understand it, and then how can you get better? So you're not going to get to where you got to with all these standardized libraries and so on unless you started to gather data on the early stages when you got going. And so, right, let's make sure we're capturing all that data, we understand it, and then can we make improvements? Can we make improvements? And you can see that journey in 10 years, how far you're going. And I'm sure there's a lot more there in the future as well that you can build in there. And and that's that little tool that you showed at the end. We're making those changes and having Revit in the background that's automatically updating them is very good. And that's that is something that architectural companies themselves can build in. It's not the way it's gone now. You can actually script in yourself without having a computer science background in there, using some of the tools that are in there linked into Revit. So very good. So that's our 3 presentations. So we'll move over onto the Q&A session at the now. So for